About 200,000 years ago, our species airdropped into existence with the same exact fancy brains and clumsy genitals we have today. 5,500 years ago, we invented writing stuff down and history started. The first 97% of the existence of our species is prehistory, and it's like those years in the 70s that David Bowie doesn't remember. We created some cool art, and otherwise we have no clue what we were doing. Lord of the Rings? Sure, could have happened twice. We would have been surprised both times. Today, the word prehistory makes us picture a caveman with a big forehead dragging a woman around, maybe painting a deer on a cave, even though it's by definition the part after evolution stopped changing our foreheads and our body in general, and all signs point to women creating most of the early art, so 0 for 2 on the only two things we know about the vast majority of our species history, which should give you some idea of how bad we are at the last 3%, otherwise known as history. Here's what Jesus probably looked like, and the reason we know that is because his name was Jesus of Nazareth and not Jesus Christ. That man-shaped thing has eyes the color of sky. Kill him. What about history's pinups? Nope, other kind of pinups that people who aren't Mel Gibson jerk off to? Ah, yes, Cleopatra, who a page full of Google image search results assure us looked like Kim Kardashian with more dramatic eye makeup. In her own time, her beauty was described by Plutarch, the guy who writes stuff down, as not in itself so remarkable that none could be compared to her. So don't get Plutarch to write your wedding vows, I guess. But actually, Cleopatra's family was famously ugly after generations of inbreeding, and here's a portrait of her from an Egyptian coin. As for that little vixen Pocahontas, who won over early white settlers by looking like a half-Asian jewel, according to reports from her time, she was apparently bald, but you'd never know it from that hat that's clearly not overcompensating for anything. We'll grant that standards for what's attractive have changed over time, but those eyes seem less like they're begging to tell you about the colors of the wind and more like they're daring you to play cards without checking her for a switchblade. When I say Shakespeare, the image that pops into your head is probably actually this 19th century forgery. It was on the cover of every Shakespeare paperback printed before forensic x-rays revealed that the name and date conveniently finger painted up in the corner was lying. There's actually only one portrait that we know was intentionally a drawing of Shakespeare. Fortunately, it was etched by Martin Druschet, an artist known in his time as not very good at this. We probably shouldn't give him anything important. And yes, I believe that's a plausible pronunciation of his name. So every image you've ever seen of Shakespeare, bald guy with a flair for dramatic collars and a mustache probably, is based on this one illustration. On the plus side, it looks like what we think of as Shakespeare, but on the other hand, so do that artist's other etchings, such as this one titled, "Guy You Can Tell Isn't Shakespeare Because I Put a Hat on Him." It's worth noting that he probably sketched Shakespeare after he was dead, and for some context, here are some portraits of celebrities drawn by a police forensic artist who was allowed to consult photographs when he drew them. From left to right, that's Bill Cosby, Tom Cruise, Ronald Reagan, and Michael Jordan. But you knew that. We're sure our image of Shakespeare based on an illustration by a terrible artist who'd never met him is right on. That's something that gets edited out of history for some reason. The awkward early years when staving off boredom suddenly replaced starvation and bear attacks as the #1 activity to stave off. We didn't know whether to go see Macbeth or watch a bunch of teenagers cram themselves into a phone booth. Footage of Houdini performing the tricks that captured the world's imagination was recently discovered by us on the internet. Here he is jumping into a river in his underwear like a crazy person, or wriggling around his straitjacket until it busts loose because it's poorly sewn. You never suspect he has magical powers, but you do get the sense that he would definitely eat a bug if you dared him to. That's because Houdini has less in common with the magicians of today than the insane things people found amusing when boredom was first invented, such as throwing picnics to watch the Civil War like a spectator sport, or setting up bleachers to watch nuclear bomb tests. That's Miss Atomic Bomb 1957. Keep your hands to yourself, fellas. She's extremely radioactive. Very dangerous. Your parents had Woodstock, but their grandparents had Crush, Texas, a temporary town built for the 40,000 spectators who flocked to watch a rich guy crash 2 trains into each other at full speed. Actually, that'd be extremely popular today and probably sponsored by Tostitos. The difference is we'd talk about how the Tostitos train crunch was a new low in our selfie taking, emoticon using, cat captioning, cartoon porn drawing, garbage TV watching, modern culture, even though, as you can see, we've always been into all of that shit.
The one time you made edible spaghetti.
That's TV show Three's a Crowd, in which a man's wife and his secretary are asked uncomfortable questions and try to tear each other's hair out while the guy feigns concern and tries to hide his erection. See, their culture was just as trashy. They just chose not to talk about their equivalent of The Real Housewives of New Jersey and pretended they only ever watched Leave It to Beaver. But at least the visual spectrum has painters and etchers. The only way to make sure history remembered that Abe Lincoln's voice was high-pitched was to teach your kids to do an undignified girly voice. But there are some weird ways we can glimpse what the world sounded like before recorded noise. For instance, you know the rebel yell is that thing Bo and Luke Duke did before ramping their car awesomely. But on the battlefield, it apparently sounded more like a coyote being raped by a bird call. Also, this blooper reel from early 20th century movies seems to indicate that everyone was just pretending to speak like that.
The stock? Oh, Jesus Christ.
And get that fine, cool air on your chest. And go swimming in little pools and... Holy Christ, where am I?
I'm sorry I started speaking like a real person for a moment. I don't know what got into me. They must never know we don't speak like carnival barkers. What's really weird is that if you took a time machine a few hundred years ago, you might not understand a single word of English.
I can him and your Saturday night. Right. They kid drove his
Those are the people from Smith Island, and they've stayed almost completely isolated since landing off the coast of Virginia in the 1600s. They still talk like people did before there was a mass media piping proper TV English into every home. When you spoke English the way your parents and their parents before them, your English was only as good as the drunkest branch of your family tree, which turns out is pretty drunk.
That's all the mud, they ain't no pass, sir. They ain't cutting that off either, that crowd going out.
That's a gym in the 1930s having not the faintest clue how exercise works. That was possible because back then food was still food, in that it went stale and mostly tasted bad. Corporate America hadn't scientifically engineered snack chips to be more addictive than heroin, so people tended to stay person-shaped until they smoked themselves to death. And if that makes you jealous, wait till you hear how drunk they were just all of the time. For instance, the Boston Tea Party was actually the Boston Rum Party, which explains the costumes. The Puritans stopped in Massachusetts because they were out of beer. The Congress of Vienna is famous for dividing up Europe after the fall of Napoleon, but in Vienna it's known more as the time the world's most powerful kings and diplomats spent 9 months blacked out in our city, fighting, or drunk driving their horses into everything in their path. Ulysses S. Grant was openly roaring drunk while commanding the Union to victory in the Civil War, which Abraham Lincoln went on record saying made him a better field general. And finally, 2 days before signing the US Constitution, George Washington, Ben Franklin, James Madison, and the 52 other delegates who were in the process of forging the greatest political document in human history went into a Philadelphia bar and between them drank 100 bottles of wine, 22 bottles of porter, 12 bottles of beer, 8 bottles of whiskey, 8 bottles of hard cider, and 7 bowls of spiked punch, which you might recognize as way more alcohol than 55 human beings should be able to consume without dying. The innkeeper also charged them 2% for all the bottles and chamber pots they broke, because they had toilet fights, I guess. And that's how they pre-gamed the signing of the US Constitution. So, just to recap, we spent the first 97% of our existence shrouded in the cultural equivalent of a blackout, finally clawed our way out of the blighted darkness and pulled the starter cord on human progress, and upon completion of what some consider to be the finest use of the written word, we celebrated by getting so drunk nobody could remember their own name, which makes you wonder if we invented writing so that we could just get as f***ed up as we wanted without worrying about remembering stuff. Hey, thanks for watching, you guys. I want you guys to pitch the best action movie that could possibly take place in an unknown pocket of history that no movie has taken place in yet, and I'm gonna steal that and then make millions of dollars off of it. You're welcome.